It was just after midnight on a Tuesday in October of 2023, and the small town of Oakridge, Oregon was currently being hammered by the most violent windstorm the region had seen in over a decade. Inside a modest two-story home on a quiet cul-de-sac, a woman named Sarah sat huddled on her living room couch, clutching a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. The power had flickered out hours ago, leaving the house in a thick, oppressive darkness that was only broken by the occasional violent strobe light of a lightning strike. Every time the wind roared, the house groaned, and Sarah found herself staring out her back sliding glass door. Outside, her backyard was a chaotic mess of swirling leaves and snapping branches, but Sarah wasn't looking at her own yard. She was looking over the low wooden fence into the backyard of her neighbor, a man who was essentially a local legend in Oakridge. And as she watched, a massive gust of wind, something that felt like it had the strength of a freight train, ripped through the trees, and for a split second, Sarah saw something that made her heart stop. In the far back corner of her neighbor's yard, near an old gnarled oak tree, a heavy, weathered blue plastic tarp that had been sitting there unmoved for 10 entire years suddenly caught the wind. The heavy stones that had weighted down the edges of that tarp for a decade were tossed aside like they were pebbles, and the tarp itself was violently whipped up into the air, dancing in the storm before being carried away into the darkness. Sarah leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging up the window. As the next flash of lightning illuminated the yard, Sarah saw what the tarp had been hiding. She saw something white, something curved, and something that looked remarkably like a human ribcage sticking out of the mud. Sarah stumbled back, her mug shattering on the floor. 10 minutes later, despite the storm, the police were fighting their way down that quiet cul-de-sac, and what they saw when they reached that oak tree would change the town of Oakridge forever. However, the real shocker wouldn't come until days later, when investigators realized exactly how the most beloved man in town had managed to hide a gruesome secret in plain sight for 10 years. This story starts a bit slow, but it spirals into madness very rapidly, and that is why this story has become one of the most infamous true crime cases in modern history. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do here at the Cipher Story. We upload new stories every single week, and if that's of interest to you, please do me a huge favor and invite the like button over for a fancy 5-course steak dinner, but right as the main course is served, tell the like button you forgot the napkins, walk into the kitchen, and then climb out the window and never come back. Also, please subscribe to the Cipher Story wherever you're watching or listening so you never miss one of our weekly deep dives into the unknown. Okay, let's get into today's story. You know, there's this unspoken rule when you move into a new neighborhood. You want to be the good neighbor. You want to be the person who waves when you're taking out the trash, the person who offers to sign for a package if someone isn't home, and definitely the person who keeps their lawn looking at least somewhat presentable. But there's a flip side to that. We all have that one neighbor who is almost too perfect. The person whose lawn is so green it looks fake. The person who is always at the community bake sales, always the first to offer help, and always has a smile that never quite reaches their eyes. And naturally, we tell ourselves we're being paranoid. We tell ourselves that some people are just nice, that they don't have skeletons in their closets because they're too busy polishing their front porch. But the thing about living next to someone for a long time is that you start to notice the things that don't change. You notice the one window that is always shuttered. You notice the one shed that stays locked. Or, in the case of this story, you notice the one blue tarp that never, ever moves. Most of the time, that curiosity is just boredom. You think, oh, they're probably just covering an old lawnmower they haven't gotten around to fixing. But every once in a while, your gut is telling you something that your brain isn't ready to believe. And that's exactly where Sarah found herself. The town of Oakridge, Oregon is the kind of place where nothing strange, dark, or mysterious is supposed to happen. It's tucked away in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, surrounded by towering Douglas firs and the kind of crisp mountain air that makes you feel like you're living in a postcard. It's a tight-knit community where everyone knows everyone's business, but in a way that feels protective rather than intrusive. At the heart of this community was a man named Dr. Arthur Penhaligon. In 2013, Arthur was 62 years old, and he was, quite literally, the most respected man in the county. He had spent 30 years as a high-level orthopedic surgeon at the regional hospital. He wasn't just a doctor. He was the man who fixed the high school quarterback's knee before the state championship. He was the man who performed pro bono surgeries for elderly residents who couldn't afford their deductibles. Arthur was tall, with a thick head of silver hair that stayed perfectly in place, and he always smelled faintly of peppermint and expensive cologne. He lived in a beautiful, sprawling ranch-style home on Oakridge Heights, a house he had shared with his wife, Martha, for over 25 years. Martha was just as beloved as Arthur. She was a former librarian with a laugh that could be heard from 2 blocks away and a passion for gardening that had turned their backyard into a literal sanctuary. People would walk by their house just to catch a glimpse of Martha's prize-winning hydrangeas and the perfectly manicured hedges that Arthur kept trimmed with military precision. They were the golden couple of Oakridge. They had 2 grown children, a son who was a lawyer in Seattle and a daughter who was a pediatrician in Portland. By all accounts, the Penhaligons had won the game of life. But then, in the summer of 2013, something changed. It started small. Neighbors noticed that Martha wasn't in her garden as often. Then they noticed she wasn't at the weekly bridge club meetings. When people asked Arthur where she was, he would give a sad, weary smile and say that Martha's sister in Arizona had fallen ill with a rare degenerative condition, and Martha had gone down there to be her full-time caregiver. "She's so selfless," Arthur would say, his voice cracking just a little. "She didn't even pack a full bag. She just took what she needed and hopped on a plane. I miss her every day, but I couldn't stand in the way of her doing what's right." The town rallied around Arthur. They brought him casseroles. They mowed his lawn for him while he was dealing with the loneliness. And when weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, and Martha still hadn't come back, the story just became part of the local lore. Martha was in Arizona. Arthur was the noble husband waiting for her return. By 2015, 2 years after Martha left, the house next door to Arthur's went up for sale. That was when Sarah moved in. Sarah was in her late 20s, a middle school English teacher who was looking for a fresh start after a messy breakup. She had grown up in a big city and was looking forward to the quiet, safe embrace of a town like Oakridge. And when she met her new neighbor, Arthur, she thought she had hit the jackpot. On her very first day of moving in, as she was struggling with a heavy box of books in her driveway, Arthur appeared out of nowhere. He didn't just offer to help, he took the box from her, carried it all the way into her living room, and then spent 30 minutes giving her the lay of the land. He told her which grocery store had the freshest produce, which mechanic wouldn't rip her off, and which neighbors she should be careful about gossiping with. "I'm Arthur," he said, extending a hand that was firm and warm. "My wife is currently away taking care of family, so it's just me and the quiet. If you ever need anything, a cup of sugar, a jump start for your car, or just someone to talk to, don't hesitate." Sarah was charmed. For the first few months, Arthur was the perfect neighbor. He would leave baskets of fresh apples from his trees on her porch. He would wave every morning at 7 a.m. as he headed out for his daily walk. He was a pillar of stability. But because she was an English teacher, she was a natural observer. She noticed details. And she started to notice that for a man who was obsessed with perfection, Arthur had one very strange blind spot. In the very back corner of Arthur's yard, right up against the fence that separated their properties, there was an old, massive oak tree, and underneath that tree, there was a large rectangular mound covered by a thick, heavy-duty blue tarp. Initially, Sarah didn't think much of it. It was a backyard, people store things. But as the seasons changed, as the vibrant greens of summer turned into the golds of autumn, and then the gray, wet sludge of an Oregon winter, Sarah noticed that the tarp never moved. Not an inch. She would see Arthur out in his yard every single weekend. He would be weeding, trimming, and power washing his siding. He was a man who couldn't stand a single leaf being out of place. But whenever he got near that back corner, his demeanor changed. He didn't trim the grass around the tarp. In fact, over the course of a year, the grass around the edges of that blue plastic died, leaving a ring of brown, scorched earth. One Saturday morning, Sarah was out on her back deck drinking coffee when she saw Arthur near the oak tree. He was standing perfectly still, just staring at the tarp. He stood there for maybe 5 minutes, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched. Sarah, trying to be friendly, called out, "Morning, Arthur. Starting a new project back there?" Arthur jumped. He spun around so fast he almost lost his balance. For a split second, the kindly doctor mask slipped. His face was twisted into an expression of pure, unadulterated rage. His eyes were wide, and his mouth was pulled back into a snarl. Sarah froze. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the rage vanished. Arthur blinked, adjusted his glasses, and gave her that familiar, practiced smile. "Oh, Sarah, you startled me," he said, his voice smooth and calm again. No project. Just some old building materials I'm keeping dry. Mark, my son, is planning on building a shed when he visits next summer. It's a bit of an eyesore, I know. I apologize." Sarah nodded, forced a smile, and went back inside. But as she sat at her kitchen table, she couldn't shake the image of Arthur's face in that moment of surprise. It wasn't the face of a man who was startled. It was the face of a man who had been caught. And as the months turned into a year, Sarah found herself looking at that blue tarp more and more. She noticed that even during the most violent rainstorms, the tarp stayed perfectly flat. It was weighted down by 8 large, heavy river stones, 4 on each side. And then she started to notice the smell. It wasn't constant. It only happened when the wind blew from the east and only during the hottest weeks of July. It was a faint, sickly sweet odor, like rotting fruit mixed with something metallic. Sarah tried to tell herself it was just a dead squirrel or maybe a compost pile that Arthur hadn't turned. But then came the summer of 2016, 3 years after Martha had left for Arizona. Arthur's daughter, Emily, came to visit. Sarah saw her pull into the driveway, and for the first time in months, Arthur looked genuinely happy. They sat out on the back patio, drinking wine and laughing. From her deck, Sarah could hear bits and pieces of their conversation. Then, Emily said something that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Dad," Emily said, her voice sounding a bit strained, "have you heard from Mom lately? I've tried calling her sister in Phoenix, but the number is disconnected, and Mom hasn't answered my emails in weeks." There was a long silence. Sarah held her breath, leaning as close to the railing as she dared. "You know your mother, Emily." Arthur's voice was low, paternal. "When she gets into caregiver mode, she shuts the world out. Her sister's condition has taken a turn for the worse. Martha told me she's staying off the grid to focus entirely on her. She'll reach out when she's ready. Don't worry so much." "I know, but 3 years, Dad? She didn't even come home for Christmas. She didn't come for my birthday." "She's making a sacrifice," Arthur said, and his voice had a sharp, final edge to it that Sarah recognized. "Now, let's talk about your practice. How are the kids in Portland?" The conversation shifted, but the seed of doubt had been planted in Sarah's mind. She knew Arthur's daughter. She knew Martha's reputation. None of this made sense. If your sister was dying, you might stay for a few months, maybe a year, but you wouldn't vanish from your children's lives for 3 years. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the blue tarp, she kept thinking about the dead grass, and she kept thinking about the way Arthur looked at that back corner of the yard. The next morning, while Arthur was out on his daily walk, Sarah did something she knew she shouldn't do. She walked to the edge of her yard, leaned over the fence, and stared at the blue tarp. Up close, the smell was stronger. It was cloying. It was the smell of something that had been buried and was trying to claw its way back to the surface. Sarah looked around to make sure the street was empty. Then she reached over the fence with a long garden rake, hooked the edge of the blue plastic just enough to lift it a few inches. She expected to see bags of concrete or maybe some old lumber. What she saw instead was a layer of thick black industrial plastic sheeting underneath the blue tarp, and on top of that black plastic sheeting there were dozens of packets of desiccant, those little silica gel packs you find in shoeboxes to keep them dry, spread out like a macabre carpet. But it was what was under the black plastic that made Sarah's heart hammer against her ribs. As she pulled the rake back, the plastic shifted, and she saw the corner of something made of leather. A vintage suitcase. A very specific vintage suitcase that she had seen in old photos of Martha Penhaligon. Suddenly, a shadow fell over Sarah. "Can I help you with something, Sarah?" Sarah screamed and dropped the rake. She spun around to find Arthur standing just on his side of the fence. He wasn't wearing his walking shoes. He was standing in the grass, perfectly silent, his face a mask of cold, clinical detachment. I thought I saw a sneak," Sarah stammered, her heart racing so fast she felt dizzy. "I was just trying to move the tarp to see if it was under there." Arthur didn't blink. He just stared at her. "There are no snakes in this neighborhood, Sarah. But there are people who don't know how to respect boundaries." He reached out, took the handle of the rake from her hand, and pulled it over to his side of the fence. "I think it's time you went inside. The sun is getting quite hot. Wouldn't want you to have a heat stroke and start seeing things that aren't there." Sarah didn't say a word. She turned and ran into her house, locking the door behind her. She spent the rest of the day with the curtains drawn, watching through a tiny slit in the fabric. She watched as Arthur spent the next 4 hours in the back corner of his yard. He didn't just move the tarp back. He brought out bags of heavy garden soil. He brought out more stones, and he spent the afternoon reinforcing the mound, packing the dirt down with a heavy iron tamper. By the time he was finished, the blue tarp was buried under 6 inches of fresh earth. It looked like a raised garden bed, a perfectly normal rectangular garden bed. But Sarah knew. She knew that Arthur wasn't planting flowers. After that confrontation at the fence, Sarah's life in Oakridge changed. It didn't happen at once. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of her peace of mind. For the first few weeks, she expected a knock on the door, either from Arthur apologizing or from the police, but neither came. Instead, Arthur began a campaign of subtle, surgical gaslighting. You have to remember, Arthur was a surgeon. He understood how to make small incisions that did the most damage. He started telling people at the local grocery store and the hospital board meetings that he was concerned about Sarah. "She's a lovely girl," he would say, leaning in close as if sharing a painful secret. "But I think the isolation is getting to her. She's been seeing things, snakes in the yard, strangers in the bushes. I've tried to help, but she seems quite paranoid. It's such a shame." Because Arthur was the golden boy of Oakridge, the town believed him. When Sarah would go to the post office or the bakery, she started noticing the way people looked at her. It wasn't the friendly, welcoming gaze she'd first experienced. It was pity. It was the look you give someone who is losing their grip on reality. And meanwhile, back at the house, Arthur was making sure Sarah did feel like she was losing her mind. He had turned that back corner, the place where the blue tarp used to be, into a beautiful raised garden bed. He had bordered it with expensive cedar planks and filled it with rich, dark soil. And then he did something that felt like a direct slap in Sarah's face. He planted Martha's favorite flowers, white hydrangeas and bleeding hearts. To anyone else, it was a touching tribute to his absent wife. To Sarah, it was a burial mound. Every night, Sarah would sit in her darkened kitchen and watch him. Arthur would come out at exactly 8:30 p.m., even in the rain, with a small watering can. He would spend 20 minutes meticulously tending to the plants on top of that mound. He would talk to them. Sarah couldn't hear the words through the glass, but she could see his lips moving, his head tilted as if he were listening to a response from the dirt. By 2018, 5 years had passed since Martha disappeared. The town had mostly stopped asking about her. In their minds, Martha was just gone. She was a sad footnote in Arthur's otherwise perfect life. But then, Arthur's son, Mark, came home for a visit. Mark was a high-powered attorney in Seattle, and unlike his sister Emily, who was more prone to believe her father's soothing explanations, Mark was a man of evidence. He had been having a hard time reaching his mother for years. Every time he called the number Arthur gave him for the care facility in Arizona, he got an answering machine, and the voice on that machine was always a generic pre-recorded message. One evening, Mark was sitting on the back patio with Arthur. Sarah was, as usual, watching from her deck. She saw Mark gesture toward the new garden bed under the oak tree. "When did you put that in, Dad?" Mark asked. "Mom always said she hated planting anything under that oak because the roots would just choke the life out of the flowers." Arthur didn't miss a beat. He took a sip of his scotch and looked at the mound with a soft expression. "She changed her mind, Mark. In one of her last letters, she mentioned how much she missed that tree. I thought, if she ever comes home, I want her to see that I was listening." "Letters?" Mark sat forward. "You've been getting letters? Why haven't you shown us?" Arthur sighed, the perfect image of a burdened man. "Because they're private, Mark. Your mother she's not the woman you remember. Her sister's illness has taken a toll on her mental state. The letters are rambling. Sometimes they don't even make sense. I didn't want to tarnish your image of her." Mark wasn't satisfied. "I want to see them, Dad. I'm her son. I have a right to know what's going on with her." Arthur stood up, his posture suddenly stiff. "Not tonight, Mark. I've had a long day at the hospital. If you can't respect my desire to protect your mother's dignity, then maybe you should find a hotel for the rest of your stay." It was the first time Arthur had ever shown a crack in the perfect father facade to his own children. Mark left the next morning, but he didn't go back to Seattle. Instead, he did something that would eventually set the gears of justice in motion. He drove to the Oakridge Police Department. But here is the problem. In a small town, you don't just walk into a police station and accuse Dr. Arthur Penhaligon of something sinister. The chief of police, a man named Miller, had been a patient of Arthur's for years. Arthur had literally saved Miller's daughter's leg after a car accident. When Mark told him his concerns, that his mother had been missing for 5 years and his father was acting strange, Miller just patted him on the shoulder. "Mark, your father is a saint. He's been through hell with your mother being away. Grief does strange things to people. He's probably just trying to shield you from the reality of her sister's condition. Go back to Seattle, take a breath, and give your dad a break." Mark was defeated. He left town, and for the next few years, things went back to a chilling kind of normal. Between 2020 and 2023, the world changed. The pandemic hit, and Oakridge went into lockdown. For Sarah, this was a nightmare. She was trapped in her house, staring at Arthur's yard every single day. And that's when she noticed the maintenance on the mound began to change. The flowers Arthur had planted, the hydrangeas and the bleeding hearts, started to die. not because of the weather, but because Arthur was doing something to the soil. Sarah saw him out there late at night, pouring gallons of some kind of white, milky liquid over the dirt. The smell that Sarah had noticed years ago, that sickly sweet metallic rot, returned with a vengeance. But now, because it was lockdown and the streets were quiet, the smell was unmistakable. It wasn't a dead squirrel. It was the smell of a stagnant, underground nightmare. And then, in the summer of 2022, Arthur did something truly bizarre. He dug up the garden bed. Sarah watched, her heart in her throat, as he shoveled the dirt away, exposing the cedar frame. But he didn't keep digging. Once he hit a certain depth, about 6 inches down, he stopped. He laid down a fresh, heavy-duty blue tarp, exactly like the one Sarah had seen 10 years prior. He didn't put the dirt back. Instead, he went to the local hardware store and bought 300 pounds of river stones. He spent an entire weekend hand-placing those stones on top of the blue tarp, creating a perfectly flat, heavy stone mosaic in the back corner of his yard. To the casual observer, it looked like a decorative Zen garden feature. But Sarah knew better. She knew the tarp was back, and she knew those stones weren't for decoration. They were weights. She began keeping a log. Every time Arthur went back to that corner, every time the smell got stronger, every time he stood there and stared at the stones for hours on end. Sarah was no longer the scared English teacher. She was a woman obsessed. She had cameras installed on the back of her house, but Arthur was smart. He had planted a row of thick arborvitae trees right along the fence line, perfectly blocking the view of that back corner from any electronic eyes. The only person who could see that tarp was Sarah, and only if she stood on her tiptoes on the very edge of her deck. By the fall of 2023, the tension in that cul-de-sac was a physical thing. Arthur knew Sarah was watching. Sarah knew Arthur knew. They were in a silent, high-stakes standoff that had lasted for a decade. Arthur's children had stopped visiting almost entirely. Mark hadn't spoken to his father in over a year. Emily would call, but the conversations were short and clinical. Arthur had become a hermit in his own perfect home. The silver hair was gone, replaced by a thin, wispy white. The military straight posture had become a permanent hunch. He looked like a man who was literally being crushed by the weight of something. On the night of October 24, 2023, the National Weather Service issued a code red for Western Oregon. A massive atmospheric river was colliding with a cold front from the north, creating what meteorologists were calling a once-in-a-generation wind event. In Oakridge, the wind began to howl around 9 p.m. By 11 p.m., the tall Douglas firs that lined the neighborhood were snapping like toothpicks. Sarah sat in her dark living room, just like we described in the cold open. She was terrified, but she couldn't look away from Arthur's yard. The wind was hitting the back of the houses with incredible force. Suddenly, she saw a light in Arthur's backyard. It was a flashlight. Arthur was out there, in the middle of a hurricane-force windstorm. He was wearing an old yellow slicker, and he was frantically trying to pile more stones onto the blue tarp. The wind was so loud Sarah could hear it screaming through the cracks in her window frames. But over the roar, she heard Arthur yelling. He wasn't yelling for help, he was yelling at the tarp. "Stay down!" he was screaming. "You stay down where I put you! You don't get to leave!" Sarah watched in horror as a massive gust of wind, nearly 90 miles per hour, ripped a branch off the oak tree and sent it crashing down onto Arthur's patio. Arthur didn't even flinch. He was on his hands and knees, clawing at the mud, trying to keep the edges of that plastic from flapping. But the earth was saturated. The raised bed he had built years ago had become a soup of mud and rot. The river stones, as heavy as they were, started to sink into the softened ground. And then, the big one hit. The wind caught the edge of the blue tarp, the same edge Sarah had lifted with a rake years before, and it didn't just flap, it inflated like a sail. Sarah saw Arthur grab the plastic with both hands, trying to use his own body weight to hold it down. For a second, it looked like he was winning. Then the wind shifted. The tarp was ripped out of Arthur's hands with such force that it threw him backward into the trunk of the oak tree. Sarah heard the thud of his body hitting the wood. The tarp flew up into the air, spiraling into the darkness like a giant blue ghost. As the next flash of lightning lit up the yard, Sarah saw the mound was gone. In its place was a shallow, muddy trench, and inside that trench, resting on a bed of degraded black industrial plastic, was the vintage suitcase Sarah had seen in 2016. But the suitcase was no longer closed. The force of the wind and the shifting of the earth had popped the rusted latches. The lid was thrown wide open, and sticking out of the mud, illuminated by the strobe light effect of the storm, was a skeletal hand. It wasn't just a hand, it was a hand wearing a very specific, very recognizable wedding ring, a gold band with a single large emerald, the same ring Martha Penhaligon had worn in every single town photograph for 30 years. But that wasn't the gruesome secret that shocked the police. Sarah grabbed her phone and dialed 911. This time, she didn't care about Arthur's reputation. She didn't care about being the crazy neighbor. She screamed into the phone that there was a body in Dr. Arthur Penhaligon's backyard. When the police arrived 15 minutes later, they found Arthur sitting in the mud next to the open suitcase. He wasn't crying, he wasn't trying to run, he was just stroking the skeletal fingers as if he were trying to comfort them. "She wanted to leave," Arthur whispered to the officers as they pulled him to his feet. "She said she was going to Phoenix, but I couldn't let her tarnish the image. We were the perfect couple. Perfect couples don't get divorced." The police began to process the scene. They carefully removed the suitcase, which contained the remains of Martha Penhaligon. But as they dug deeper into the trench that had been hidden under that blue tarp for a decade, their shovels hit something else. Something hard. Something metallic. They cleared away the mud and found a second suitcase, and then a third. When the police in Oakridge, Oregon found that first suitcase on the night of the storm, they thought they were looking at a tragic case of domestic homicide. They thought Arthur Penhaligon had simply snapped 10 years ago and spent a decade hiding his wife in the backyard. But as the floodlights were brought in and the rain continued to pour, the investigation shifted from a single murder to something far more sinister. Underneath the layer of blue tarp and fresh river stones, investigators discovered a total of 4 vintage suitcases. They were all identical, high-end, leather-bound luggage from the 1980s. Each one had been meticulously wrapped in industrial-grade black plastic and surrounded by those desiccant packets Sarah had seen years earlier. The police cordoned off the entire block. Forensics teams spent the next 48 hours carefully extracting the remains. The first suitcase, as we know, contained Martha Penhaligon, but it was the second suitcase that sent a shockwave through the Pacific Northwest. Inside were the remains of a young woman who had gone missing in 2015. Her name was Chloe Vance. Chloe had been a nurse at the same hospital where Arthur was a senior surgeon. At the time of her disappearance, the police theory was that she had simply walked away from her life. She was young, she was struggling with debt, and there were rumors she was having an affair with a married man. Arthur himself had been the one to give the police a statement back then, saying he'd noticed Chloe seemed unstable and distracted in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Because Arthur was a pillar of the community, his word was taken as gospel. The search for Chloe had been called off after only 2 weeks. Now, 8 years later, Chloe was found less than 50 feet from Arthur's back door. The third and fourth suitcases contained 2 men. One was a local drifter who had moved on in 2018, and the other was an elderly patient of Arthur's who had supposedly died of natural causes in 2021. The town of Oakridge watched in stunned silence as the black coroner's vans lined the street. Their hero, their doctor, their saint, was a serial killer who had been using his own backyard as a private cemetery for a decade. 2 days later, Arthur Penhaligon sat in an interrogation room at the county jail. He had been stripped of his silver-haired dignity. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit, and his hands were cuffed to the table. Sitting across from him was Chief Miller, the man whose daughter Arthur had saved. Miller looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He laid out the photos of the 4 suitcases on the table. "Why, Arthur?" Miller asked, his voice trembling. "Martha, I can almost understand a moment of rage, but the others? Chloe? Why did you do this?" Arthur didn't look at the photos. He looked at his own hands, his surgeon's hands, which were now wrinkled and stained with the memory of the mud. "You don't understand the burden of perfection, Miller," Arthur said, his voice cold and clinical. "This town, it looks up to me. I fix things. When a bone is shattered, I put it back together. When a life is messy, I resolve it." Arthur began to explain his logic. It wasn't about bloodlust, it was about control. Martha hadn't just wanted to leave. In 2013, she had discovered that Arthur had been overprescribing opioids to his patients and taking a massive kickback from a pharmaceutical representative. She had threatened to go to the board. "She was going to destroy the image," Arthur whispered. "She was going to make us those people, the ones everyone gossips about. I couldn't have that, so I fixed the problem." He had waited until she was asleep, used a sedative from his surgical kit to ensure she wouldn't struggle, and then used his knowledge of anatomy to end her life quickly. He didn't want her to suffer. He just wanted her to be quiet. But once he had hidden Martha under that blue tarp, something shifted in his mind. He realized that he could fix other problems in the same way. Chloe Vance hadn't been unstable. She had caught Arthur stealing surgical supplies to sell on the black market. The drifter in 2018 had seen Arthur burying something in the yard late at night. The elderly patient in 2021 had discovered that Arthur had botched his surgery and was planning a malpractice suit. In Arthur's mind, he wasn't a murderer. He was a janitor of the community. He was cleaning up the things that didn't fit the perfect narrative of Oakridge. The blue tarp was a symbol, Arthur told the investigators. It represents the sky. It's what you see when you look up. I thought if I put the sky over them, they would be at peace. And the stones were to keep the truth from floating away. As the investigation continued, the police used Arthur's own meticulous logs, which they found hidden in a cipher in his medical journals, to reconstruct the timeline. Every time Sarah had seen him out in the yard, talking to the dirt, Arthur was actually performing a maintenance check. The milky white liquid Sarah had seen him pouring over the soil, it wasn't garden fertilizer. It was a high-concentration industrial enzyme used in morgues to accelerate the breakdown of organic tissue while simultaneously neutralizing the chemical gases of decomposition. Arthur had been stealing it from the hospital's pathology lab for years. He was literally trying to dissolve his victims into the earth so that eventually, if the tarp were ever moved, there would be nothing left but dust. But he had made one fatal mistake. He had used those vintage suitcases. The suitcases were made of a high-quality treated leather that was nearly airtight. Instead of allowing the enzymes to reach the bodies, the suitcases had acted like time capsules. They had preserved the remains and the wedding ring on Martha's finger for an entire decade. Arthur had been so focused on the surface, on the grass, the flowers, the stones, and the perfect blue of the tarp, that he had failed to realize the very containers he chose were his undoing. During the reconstruction, the police also realized how close Sarah had come to being victim number 5. On the day in 2016 when Sarah had lifted the tarp with her rake, Arthur hadn't just been startled. He had already decided that Sarah was a variable that needed to be resolved. He had her name written in the back of his medical journal under a section titled Future Consultations. The only reason Sarah is alive today is that the COVID-19 lockdown happened. Arthur became paranoid about being seen outside with a body when the streets were empty and everyone was looking out their windows. He decided to wait. He decided to gaslight her into silence until the world went back to normal. But the storm of 2023 didn't wait for Arthur's schedule. The trial of Dr. Arthur Penhaligon was the most watched event in Oregon history. Because of the sheer amount of evidence, the logs, the enzymes, the suitcases, and the testimony of the neighbor who never stopped watching, the jury didn't even need a full hour to reach a verdict. In January of 2024, Arthur was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder. Because of the premeditated nature of the crimes and the prey on the vulnerable aspect of his victims, the judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Arthur Penhaligon, the man who spent his life fixing broken things, will spend the rest of his life in a 6 by 9 foot cell in the Oregon State Penitentiary. Sarah, the English teacher who saved her own life by being observant, eventually moved away from Oakridge. She sold her house, but only after she saw the new owners rip out the arborvitae trees and dig up that back corner of the yard. Today, if you walk down that quiet cul-de-sac in Oakridge, the house looks perfectly normal. There are new flowers in the garden, there is a new family playing on the lawn. But the neighbors, the ones who lived through it, they still don't look at that back corner, and they definitely don't buy blue tarps. Because they know that sometimes the most dangerous thing in your neighborhood isn't the strange, dark, and mysterious stranger in the shadows. It's the perfect man next door, waiting for a storm to blow his cover. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Cipher story. If you found this story as chilling as I did, please make sure you've absolutely obliterated that like button. Tell the like button you're going to help it move into a new house, but then just leave it standing on the sidewalk with all its boxes while you drive away into the sunset. If you have a story suggestion or a mystery you want us to dive into, leave a comment below or send us a message on our social media platforms. We read every single one of your suggestions. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our uploads. We have many stories just like this one on the channel, so if you're looking for more of the strange, dark, and mysterious, just click the playlist on your screen right now. I'm your host for the Cipher story, and I'll see you in the next one. Until next time, stay curious and keep watching the neighbors.